Welcome, everyone. This is the first of a series of talks that we will be hosting jointly the Applied Ethics Center at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where I'm an associate provost, and Nir is the director of the Applied Ethics Center. And we have been collaborating for a while and are kicking up our game this year by starting a new research program around the future of work. And the kind of questions that we initially imagined before COVID were things like automation, the effects of automation on inequality and the nature of work, whether a workless future would be a meaningful one, what meaningful work means, those kinds of questions. Now, since COVID, I think the questions have become even more pointed because of the Great Resignation that many people around the world are re-examining work and what kinds of work they want to do, and have been thinking about the kinds of solutions that at the IET we've been talking about for a long time, universal basic income and solutions like that. As a part of the kicking off of the series, I was delighted to invite Kevin because Kevin and I had worked together on a book called Surviving the Machine Age, which came out in 2017 and collected volume that looked at questions like what kinds of jobs might there be in a more automated future. And it's been a perennial, but Kevin did the bulk of the work on that. Thank you, Kevin, for allowing me to be the co-editor of that. But Kevin is also the author of a book called Artificial Slaves, which is about the pre-modern conceptions and imaginations of having mechanical slaves, which for me, always having had an interest in kind of deep cultural influences on our contemporary ways of thinking about things, was an important place to start, because I do think, as Kevin will explain, there are some philosophical questions that come out of this deep cultural interest we've had in transcending human slavery by substituting human-animal hybrids or dolls or robots or whatever kind of androids we might have imagined in the past. And so with that, let's see, Kevin is Professor Emeritus at New York Institute of Technology and a fellow of the IIT. And I would like to also mention that we just have hired a postdoc to work on this program at UMass Boston. We will be announcing that shortly, but we're very excited about having a two-year postdoc who will be advancing the project that I've described. So Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin LaGrandeur, as Jay just said. Thanks, Jay, for turning it over my way. Let me start by thanking UMass Boston Center for Applied Ethics and the Institute for Ethics in Emerging Technology and their respective directors for inviting me to give this talk. Just a note before I begin that some of the ideas I'm going to discuss here appear in somewhat different form in recent articles published in the journals AI and Ethics and in the Journal of Posthumanism. So let me start by summarizing my argument in this presentation. I'll be talking about this stuff for about the next 25 minutes. So to summarize, my argument here is that our development of intelligent technology over the years has combined mimesis with an Hegelian dialectic to create an ironic and possibly dangerous mimetic cycle in today's post-human world. As a species, we have moved from creating intelligent tools in our own functional image to having those tools execute human functions so well that they're forcing us to remake ourselves in their machinic image. In other words, we're in a situation where, in order to survive competition from our own intelligent inventions, we must incorporate ourselves or into ourselves elements of those very inventions, or risk losing jobs and perhaps even existential viability. So we've gone from creating imitations of ourselves to having those intelligent artifacts imitate us, not just normally, but in ways that have begun to surpass our own abilities. And I'll talk about some examples of that And then I'm going to conclude by suggesting some ways that we can happily regulate what we do with regards to invention of these intelligent technologies that will help to make this less of a Wild West situation. So, for example, just to begin, some ways that things have begun to, our mechanical or intelligent technologies begun to surpass our own abilities. For example, today in the activities of chess playing and radiology diagnoses, we have AI that is far better at those things than any human being. And we've also allowed ourselves to rely on them too much, especially for decision making. Thus, the artificial servants that we've made threaten to upend the master-servant relationship between us and them. As an indication of where we're headed, we've already allowed even some of our simpler and older technology to control our decisions too readily today. An example of this that I think is particularly good is GPS. There are numerous instances around the world of travelers dying in remote areas because they blindly trusted the directions of their GPS. And even though the GPS took them into unexpected and dangerous areas or off paved roads. In fact, this is so common a phenomenon, especially in the United States, that it has a name, death by GPS. And this has been happening. We've been having a lot of snowstorms here in the United States, and this kind of thing especially tends to happen in snowstorms. People get lost, they go taken by their GPS off-road into some wilderness, they get stuck, and then they die. There are other examples too. Automated algorithmic trading in financial markets has caused numerous so-called flash crashes of the market over the past 15 years here in the United States. And pilots who are over-dependent on their automated flight technology have caused horrific plane crashes. The most famous of these was the Air France Flight 447 crash off the coast of Brazil in 2009, which killed 228 people. In that crash, the flight recorders indicated that pilots did not know what to do when their autopilots failed during a crisis, and then the plane crashed. More recent AI servants pose even greater danger to human dominance, and yet an even greater temptation to rely on them too much. There are intelligent machines that can displace more of us from our jobs, for example, and yet corporations will rely on them because they increase the profit margin. These include automated workers like robotic bartenders on some Carnival Corporation cruise ships, automated chefs and hotel workers in some parts of Japan, and the Baxter factory android made in Boston that's meant to replace human workers. That was Rodney Brooks's project. Highly educated white-collar workers are not immune either to losing jobs to intelligent technology. Natural language generators, or NLGs, like Wordsmith, which is made by Automated Insights, are already used by Associated Press and other large news organizations for writing sports and financial stories. No humans needed. And AI applications derived from the same source are being used to scan, correct, and write legal documents, which replaces paralegals. Coming next, the OpenAI Corporation, owned by Elon Musk, has made a text generating AI system called GPT-3, which is in prototype and can generate all kinds of human-like texts, from essays to instant messages to emails, and even computer code. Think of all the people whom that could replace, maybe even academics. Worse, there are intelligent applications that corporations are beginning to use that can control even our access to jobs and our actions once we get those jobs. Examples of the first include AI applications for screening job applicants and even for interviewing candidates. The problem with these kinds of tools is that they make the process more machinic, less nuanced, more data-oriented. Thus, they don't screen for crucial soft criteria like whether someone has personality qualities that make them easy to work with. These tools also reduce us to data points, exposing us to data biases and demeaning our worth. But they promise to save companies lots of money. So does an even more scary AI application being used by some companies in China. There, some businesses are monitoring data from employees' brains by forcing them to wear caps outfitted with sensors while they work. These sensor array caps can scan workers' brain waves for emotional disturbances and send that data to a central office where it's processed by AI. At one such factory, Hangzhou Zhongheng Electric, the management feeds the data into algorithms that allow AI to recommend how to manage these wired up human workers, for instance, by adjusting the pace of production and redesigning workflows. So what you have there is you actually have a flip of the situation where instead of humans using machines to do work, the machines use humans to do work. And by the way, China has a lot of problematic uses of intelligent technology. Just yesterday in the New York Times, there's a front page article about China continuing to use COVID tracking AI that they force people to put on their phones to surveil their society, and not just the Uyghurs, but the Han Chinese as well. So this is very disconcerting news. Most dangerous of all, I think, there are newer AIs that pose existential threats to humanity. And yet the siren call of these artificial intelligent servants is strong for those who would employ them. Lethal autonomous weapons systems like the United States' Reaper drone and robotic machine guns that are used at the South Korean border with North Korea can spare the human lives of the country that uses them because their soldiers are not at risk. So the temptation to increasingly rely on them is great. And yet they're not as good as humans at determining exactly who is an enemy combatant and who is not. And thus they pose an increasing existential risk to humans the more they're used. Although exact statistics are disputed, there's no doubt that there has been a lot of so-called collateral damage, in other words, civilian death, caused by the United States unmanned aerial attack drones, as one may see from numerous news articles, including pretty recent news, such as what happened in Syria and Afghanistan recently. And the final and greatest danger is that our creations will turn the tables on us and replace us as a species. Now, that may sound sensationalistic, or at least to be far in the future, but the peril is possible and significant enough that some of the chief innovators of intelligent technology have warned us from the beginning of the digital age about the existential risks of over-reliance on what they think might become our intelligent doppelgangers. These dire existential warnings began with Norbert Wiener and Martin Heidegger in the 1950s, and they continue more recently with prominent technologists such as Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Bill Joy, and Stephen Hawking. Wiener, for instance, who is widely considered the originator of robotics and AI, began worrying soon after his pioneering work in the 1940s that humans would, quote, accept the superior dexterity of machine-made decisions without too much inquiry as to the motives and principles behind these, end quote. And Bill Joy, the founder of Sun Microsystems, has been so wary of the dangers of the intelligent tools he was helping to create that in 2000, he published a famous essay in Wired magazine titled, "Why the Future Doesn't Need Us," the us being computer engineers. That essay was full of dire warnings, such as his statement that, quote, "I may be working to create tools which will enable the construction of the technology that may replace our species," end quote. Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Stephen Hawking have all publicly echoed Joy's apocalyptic statements about AI threatening our very existence. Now, I'm not sure I would take as extreme a stance as this, but the fact that these people say these things and these people are much more knowledgeable than me, that worries me. The key dangerous action that we're prone to making with regard to the intelligent tools that we make in our image is ceding too much of our own agency to them. This flaw of ours is central to the warning I just used from Norbert Wiener's work about accepting the superior dexterity of machine-made decisions without too much inquiry. Jacques Ellul, a French philosopher, put it a little bit differently in his book, Ce que je crois, or What I Believe. In that book, he said that we are, in effect, mediated by technology. And so we've moved from adapting technology to our needs toward a situation where human beings have to adapt to it. In other words, what all of these experts fear and predict is that our over-reliance on our artificial servants poses a risk of an Hegelian dialectic in which the master-slave relationship reverses. Hegel, just for those of you who haven't read Hegel lately, let me just run through a quick and dirty summary. Hegel posited that masters attain their positions because they have the superior skills and power to dominate others, and so can force them to do work. But if these servants are relied upon too much, Hegel asserts, the masters become soft and inferior at doing the very tasks that made them dominant in the first place, which allows the increasingly knowledgeable and skilled servants to surpass the abilities of the masters and become dominant in a dialectical reversal. In the case of humans and their artificial servants, then, this reversal is not likely to be a Terminator-style deadly rebellion of AI against its human makers, but instead an increasing displacement of humans in jobs, logistical and social operations, and an increasing regulation of humans by AI, like in that Chinese factory I just mentioned, and the necessity for us, therefore, to adapt to it, as Jacques Ellul worries. In other words, according to people like Musk, and Hawking and Bill Joy for that matter, the replacement of our species in a less violent but inevitable evolutionary sense than the Terminator scenario is likely if and when AI surpasses our cognitive abilities. How do these leading thinkers propose we should fix this? Well, some like Gates, Joy, and Hawking recommend increased regulation about developing AI. Gates, for instance, has proposed a robot tax, that every time a company employs robotics in place of humans, they have to pay a tax to replace the money generated, especially the income tax, generated by human workers. And then they would use that money to improve the lot of those displaced workers. Other people like Elon Musk, Ray Kurzweil, Hans Moravec, and Rodney Brooks all think that our only way of avoiding obsolescence is to make ourselves more like our creations in a sort of reverse mimesis. In other words, because we made AI in our image and it started superseding us in its very imitation of our abilities, we now need to embrace the next wave in the dialectic. We have to imitate AI in order to stop it from dominating us. In practical terms, this means that we need to incorporate into ourselves more technology, a cyborgization of ourselves, in a process of merging with AI, making ourselves a more post-human species for survival, in order to stave off irrelevance at best, or obsolescence at worst. This process has not only been proposed, but it's already begun. There have been in the past few years some smaller innovations, like the robo-glove for auto workers made by NASA and Ford Motor Company, which allows a worker to wear this glove, and it has AI-enhanced artificial muscles that reduce repetitive stress injuries, and also an implantable memory chip to enhance memory and skills acquisition. One of the projects of this type with the highest profile is one being carried out by Elon Musk's corporation Neuralink. They've been working on a type of brain-computer interface, or BCI, called neural lace, which is Musk's name for it, to keep humans competitive with AI by providing cognitive enhancement to humans. Now, neural lace is essentially a Wi-Fi antenna that can be implanted in the brain and connected directly to external digital devices through the Wi-Fi signal. It was originally developed by a Harvard team to help epileptic and Parkinson's patients who need what might be called pacemakers for the brain. These folks have to be wired to external devices that regulate brain activity because their conditions are so extreme. And in order to not have to carry around something with wires and coming out of their head and so forth, the Harvard team thought they could develop something wireless. But Musk's vision for neural lace is far more radical than that. He has the ultimate goal of making us superhumanly smart. Using this implanted Wi-Fi antenna, Musk envisions it as a way for humans to communicate more efficiently via a sort of digital telepathy. And he also sees it as a way for humans to compete with AI, which he thinks will surpass us very soon and put us at an existential disadvantage. Among other things, Musk argues that as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, it will lead to mass unemployment, something that James Hughes and I agree with and also worry about. There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot can't do better, Musk said at a recent World Government Summit. His long-range plan, though, is even bigger. He wants BCIs in a bidirectional capacity so that plugging in could make us smarter, improve our memory, help with decision-making, and eventually provide an extension of the human mind. But what will be lost? I want to ask, what will be lost in such a transformation? What are the dangers? Does this reverse mimesis, this incorporation of machinic elements into ourselves, especially into our behavioral and cognitive functions, threaten to dehumanize us, make us more machinic? Back in the 1960s, Philip K. Dick's science fiction novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, known by its more famous film title, Blade Runner, presaged these questions. The humans in the novel's future world deluded themselves into thinking they were superior to the intelligent androids they made, chiefly because they had deeper, broader emotional capacity. The hypocrisy of this was shown in the novel by humans' blind reliance on their intelligent machines for much of that capacity. In fact, in the opening chapters, we see the main character, Rick Deckard, and his wife completely relying on a machine, the mood organ, for their emotions, which are supplied by dialing in various codes and then experiencing emotions as a result of the codes they dialed in. And virtually all of them also rely in the book on what we would call a multi-user holographic online video game called the empathy box to maintain their senses of empathy with fellow humans. The very emotion, by the way, that androids all lack and which humans use as an excuse for discrimination against them. So humans don't possess it either unless they have these extra helpers, these AI helpers, to make them empathetic. Indeed, in real life, the emerging technology I've been discussing raises the question of human autonomy and agency. There have already been problems with this regarding the use of today's hardwired BCI for psychotherapy. So BCI, brain-computer interface, is already being used as a form of next-generation deep brain stimulation to treat mood and emotional disorders, especially obsessive-compulsive disorder and depression. So if an AI is controlling the brain's moods and the reactions a person has towards her environment, then patients and physicians both worry, is it the person or the AI being expressed at any given moment? As some neuroscientists working on this type of BCI point out, and I'm quoting here, if an AI controller is added into this circuitry, one has effectively constructed a device that autonomously determines what the patient may or may not feel, end quote. Some patients who have been treated for depression started losing in this manner their sense of self. One said, and another quote here, there are parts of this where you just wonder how much is you anymore. And you wonder kind of how much of it is my thought pattern? How would I deal with this if I didn't have the stimulation system? You kind of feel artificial. end quote. So to conclude, I'm going to present some possible solutions to this kind of situation. And I think it mainly depends upon a sort of regulation, which we're trying to do now. I think we're at the very beginning of this kind of regulation, similar to what we've done with nuclear weapons. But there needs to be systems set up. So let me just conclude by talking a little bit about the things I think could help. Ultimately, imitation is part of how we may be painting ourselves into a corner with our intelligent technology, in the sense that to survive the powerful products of our own ingenuity designed to imitate us, we'll be forced to make ourselves more like them in a sort of reverse mimesis, which I keep using because I invented that term and I like using it. So that in turn will cause many social problems we didn't bargain for. For example, the increasing datafication and algorithmization of humans is leading to a loss of privacy and agency, as we've already seen in the examples I've presented above or before. And this in turn makes us more like our machines, risking a gradual dehumanization. The fact that incorporating smart technology into our bodies has already been normalized enough that leading thinkers discussed previously would seriously consider it as a way to enhance our species and fortify it against our own artificially intelligent inventions shows one of the possible negative effects of the posthumanist condition. Emerging technology is changing our very concept of what humans are and what place they occupy in the hierarchy of things. This has been rightfully celebrated by some people because the decentering of humans opens up space for a larger consideration of other species and of the Earth itself as every bit as special as humans. But this change also presents the possibility of our own denigration if we end up becoming more cyborgic, which is already happening. Even our constant and increasing immersion in digital media has this implicit effect. Jaron Lanier, a famous Silicon Valley writer and programmer, argues, quote, when developers of digital technologies design a program that requires you to interact with a computer as if it were a person, they ask you to accept in some corner of your brain that you might also be conceived of as a program, end quote. Thus, by even engaging with intelligent artifacts, we're already seduced into being algorithmized, which is tied with the reduction of everything and everyone to data so that AI and the corporate and government entities that own it gain power and ascendancy. If this trend continues unobstructed, excuse me, we will come to live in an ever more corporatized, impersonal, and inhumane environment than we do now. We're partway down that road now, and consider how much more valuable our personal data is compared to the body to which it's attached. At least in the United States, the homeless and the old, for instance, are seen as inconvenient and unproductive bodies. But the data about who they are, where they are, and what they do is a valuable commodity to be traded to large corporate entities so that they can determine how they affect the money and buying habits of various regions. Now, I don't mean to militate against technological progress. I know I've said a lot of negative things here. I think we should encourage innovation, but we also need to be judicious and careful about how we do it. The only way to avoid being subsumed by our own clever technology in our increasingly post-human world is to tighten the reins a little bit on our progress by instituting careful regulation of what we create and how it's disseminated. There are a number of plausible ways to do this, and I want to conclude here by presenting some of them, which I promised a little earlier. So one way might be a type of broad statement of ethical standards that scientists and researchers would agree to in order to try to ensure those who create AI were operating along the same ethical lines. The recently published Montreal Declaration regarding the responsible development of AI does this for emerging technology. Originally drafted and promoted by computer scientist Yoshua Bengio and others at a recent meeting of concerned academics at the University of Montreal, the declaration is now posted online for the signature of anyone who's worried about the responsible development of emerging technology. You can go find it if you just Google Montreal Declaration, and then you'll see a document, sort of a manifesto, and an area where you can sign. Another model is provided by Alan Buchanan's Global Institute for Justice in Innovation, or GIGI, that he discusses in his book called Beyond Humanity. Now, this institute, this idea of Buchanan's, would be an institute that would license companies to distribute emerging technology, especially those technologies meant to be embedded in human beings, and make sure by various means that such innovations are used and distributed fairly. A third way, promoted by Nick Bostrom in his article called The Vulnerable World Hypothesis, would be to regulate and license access to key materials rather than licensing the end product, license the key materials for making dangerous innovations rather than by regulating their output. This would have the possible advantage of discouraging rogue operators, which unfortunately is kind of what the Chinese are right now. Whatever we choose, we need to have some regulation. There's much possible good in our smart technology, but we need to be careful to keep these applications humane, equitable, and non-threatening. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. I'll be keeping stacks, so if you want to raise your hand. Okay. Din Mukmahed. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just uploading. But if it's like time for asking questions,
sure.
I had one question in mind, actually, too. One of them is that I was doing a little like research paper on the AI and counterterrorism operations in the United States, and it was like very small in scale. But there was like one thing that in European Union, they have like European Commission that actually talks about ethical standards for AI technology development, and that they should all align, as you've just said. And another thing was that any AI program that was like meant to sort of predict any terroristic activity was always biased in terms of their creators. Like all the biases of the creators were translated into the model itself. And I was just curious if like whether it always applies that like if we create some AI algorithm that, for example, manages the workforce, whether the implicit biases of its creators gonna be like exacerbated by it, and like whether we should worry about it as well. Oh, and also, sorry, and the third question was that in terms of economic development and how many AI-powered technologies can replace the real like human workers. I remember there was like one professor whose name I unfortunately forgot, but he said that it just implies the transition from sort of a repetition economy where your work is just to repeat certain tasks over and over again, to a unit economy where your work is ultimately to be like more creative and think on the spot, like to work on the problems that are always unique, like mostly unique, and can't be dealt with via an algorithm. Yeah. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so to answer your first question about data bias is a big problem. For one of the reasons is that most of us aren't aware of our own biases, and so the people who create these huge databases to train deep learning algorithms, deep learning AI, like for instance the Go program and chess playing programs, it's not a problem if you have data bias there, because basically you're just feeding in tons and tons of chess games. But when you are creating facial recognition technology and you feed in tons and tons of data about faces, where do you get that data? You scrape it off the internet. Where do you scrape it from? Well, at least up to this point, the people who make those databases haven't been aware enough of where they're taking data from and how that data is formed. And then, so they've been generating data bias. The famous one, of course, is that only white people are regularly correctly recognized by facial recognition technology, and other ethnicities are not. In fact, they're recognized as animals in some cases. So yeah, it's always a problem. And I think that's one big thing that that regulators, well, first of all, I think people who make AI and make databases need to just constantly be aware of that. I think everybody, all science labs should have an ethicist on board as part of their permanent staff. Already, a famous geneticist at Harvard, let's see, I'm trying to remember his name now, George Church, has said he hired an ethicist for his team specifically to try to avoid ethical problems with his biotechnology research. I think that's great. I think we should do that. The other question about, let's see, about robots taking jobs. Well, I mean, yes, your professor's suggestion that that's because we could move to a new type of job basis where it's more creative work, more managerial work, more type of work that humans are good at that machines aren't. Yes, that'd be great, but not everybody's built to do that kind of stuff. I mean, you have to have a college degree to do any kind of managerial work these days, which is typically the more creative, human-oriented work. What if you have a high school degree and you can't get a job because all the production line jobs are being taken over by robots? That's a problem. Also, like I said, white collar work. What about accountants? Most of their work, because it's numerical and number crunching, can be done by AI now, or even just simple computer programs like Quicken. So what does my accountant do? Well, my accountant then has moved more toward hand-holding, what I call hand-holding, where he, instead of crunching the numbers himself, he lets a program do that, but then he explains to me sort of intangible things about my financial situation. All right, great. But not everybody, first of all, not everybody has the wherewithal to be trained to do different type of work. So what do they do? James and I, in our book, and some of the other authors in that book, suggest that one of the big things that we need to do is universal basic income to accommodate people who cannot make the transition, at least in the short term. In the long term, I think that our whole society will be very different. By long term, I mean 20 years from now. But in the 20-year generation that we're in now, we're going to have a lot of problems. And those problems are already manifest through all of the social and political upheaval that's going on right now in the United States. I think my own opinion is that it's rooted in the displacement of workers. People who are not highly educated have trouble getting decent paying jobs, and they feel completely cast out from society. And then violence ensues, just like it did back at the turn of the century 100 years ago. We're in a second Gilded Age. So, and I think another thing that needs to be paid more attention to, last of all, is cobots, that is, cooperative robots that operate to enhance human ability to do work rather than replace human abilities to do work. I mean, this is all ideal. Right now, though, the shortest way between A and Z is to simply put robots into the jobs and kick humans out. And that's something that we need to fix, or our society is going to suffer.
Greg.
Hi, I'm just going to quickly apologize. I have a class at 1, so I hope I can hear the whole answer, but I have 3 points, comments perhaps. First is the corporation is an algorithm. Arguably, it perhaps is a form of AI, and it elevates profit above all externalities. And, of course, there's many years of critiques of how that very mechanism is dehumanizing. The second is that with deep learning technology itself, multi-layer neural nets, no one actually understands how an AI arrives at what it does. And there currently aren't any really strong, robust mechanisms for interrogating. We can understand the inputs, certainly, the data set that it draws upon. And then thirdly, there's an element of built-in inequality like efforts like Neuralink, which perhaps could be simplified by saying the most bandwidth will go to those with the most money. Or just imagine if we look at the rapidly emerging future as the evolution of Windows. You could be locked into Windows 7 for many years. And so there will be, by definition, inequality built into the system and a kind of prison of upgrades. So I'm just throwing these out and like to hear Kevin's response to these points.
Well, I think I'll take your last comment first. I totally agree with you that the planned obsolescence of technology is something that annoys the heck out of me. You're trapped in this series of upgrades because companies like Apple take, say, the iPhone 6, and by next year it'll be obsolete because they won't allow updates anymore to it. So it becomes a brick. It's just sort of cheating you out of your money in a certain way. To go back to your first point about capitalism and AI, I've always thought, one of my degrees is in economics, and I've always thought capitalism was a machine. It's a perfect example of a machine whose cogs and parts are made of human beings, but in that machine, they cease to be anything but a cog, and it's an amoral system. It's not immoral, it's not moral, it's amoral. It's a profit-making machine, as you said. And we can't expect much as a result. In corporations, it's a reason I don't like the idea of, well, let corporations try to regulate themselves first, and then the government can regulate it. The corporations never regulate themselves adequately because their first purpose, as you said, is to make money, and that's the machinic part. It's an artificial construct added onto the machine that causes it to do anything moral at all. So I would agree with you on that too. And as far as AI being a black box, deep learning being a black box, yeah, that's a pretty standard issue for computer scientists, and also a big problem for ethicists, right? Those of us here who try to think philosophically or ethically about deep learning AI, it can be a problem because it is a black box. We don't know, and computer scientists can't even know exactly how they come to their conclusions. We just know it works. After AI goes through thousands and thousands of data sets and makes its own mistakes, it develops a model for itself that we don't quite understand because it's not ours, right? So that black box issue, I think, is going to become, I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's going to become a bigger issue as time goes on.
Near.
Kevin, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating talk. A couple of questions. It seems to me that that there's two kinds of concerns that you have, and that the level of worry perhaps isn't or shouldn't be the same in both of them. So one kind of concern that I heard has to do with the actual performance of the AIs. So the example there would be that the autonomous weapon will be worse at distinguishing combatants and non-combatants, or that the face recognition algorithm will be better at recognizing the faces of white men, etc. And to some extent, both of those have been the case. I think these are, in the end, profoundly solvable questions, profoundly solvable, technically solvable issues if the motivation is there to solve them. So a AI weapon that kills too many civilians, I would argue, can improve more quickly than a human who kills too many civilians can. And a biased facial recognition system could improve if the data sets were better, if the self-correction mechanisms were better, if more of the coders were of diverse backgrounds. In short, if the commercial and political motivation was there to improve it. So I guess one question for you is, if X hypothesis, I think it's a plausible hypothesis, but if X hypothesis, the machines start doing a more equitable job than we do, if they have less justice problems, as it were, than we do, is there anything from your perspective left to worry about? So that's one question. I guess the other question goes to the initial premise of your talk. Is this really a new development that the machines are now beginning to impact us in a way that forces us to adapt ourselves to them, or is that part of the very nature of technology? Namely that whenever we have a machine, we kind of change our worldview. I mean, that's kind of Heidegger and Carl Schmitt's points initially, that the very use of an axe makes you, for example, walk through the wood and, you know, see it as potential raw material for you, whereas without that, maybe you would be more in awe of it, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, okay, so let me talk about the first question first. The concerns about my concerns about actual performance. Let's take the combatants versus non-combatants issue. And I came to these concerns not on my own, but through reading computer scientists' attempts to create lethal autonomous weapons. There's a famous scientist that the best source on this, the most complete one, is a guy named Ronald Arkin at Georgia Tech, who did a study for the Department of Defense funded by DARPA. He was trying to create an artificial conscience for robots so that it could be used in lethal autonomous weapons on the battlefield. And one of the key things it would do is help you distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Also would instill a sense of guilt, like humans have if they kill the wrong person, some sort of remorse so that it wouldn't do it again. Because humans, part of the reasons, the things that our emotions give us is an aversion toward making a second mistake like the first one we made. So you kill a civilian by accident, you're very loath to kill another civilian by accident. But robots don't have that issue. The upside, of course, is robots also don't get battle fatigue or PTSD, but there's a multitude of problems. I mean, yeah, you mentioned that improvements could be made, but only technical improvements, like, for instance, facial recognition. But Arkin wrote a whole book on this called Governance of Lethal Autonomous Weapons. It's in Amazon. I read the whole thing, and he failed ultimately to make an algorithm that could provide something like a conscience or a guide for a robot, because it's just hard. It's almost impossible to translate human ethics into algorithms. I mean, because first of all, you got to use a limited set of ethical standards, like that are algorithmizable. For instance, you can use Kantian deontology, or you can use John Stuart Mill's system, because they're the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's very if-then type of system, both of those systems. So he tried to use those, but ultimately the algorithms don't lend themselves to the complexities, because even if you have an if-then sort of structure in your algorithms, there are all kinds of complicated situations the robot would get itself into in the real battlefield conditions that it wouldn't be able to handle in an ethical way. Also, if it killed a civilian, first of all, telling a civilian from a combatant is difficult, because a lot of times the combatants are dressed like civilians. The difference is maybe they have an AK-47, but what if it's not an AK-47? What if they have a grenade hidden under a robe? So the robot doesn't know what to shoot and what not to shoot. And anyway, the point is that Arkin came up with the conclusion that it was really impossible to make a sufficiently responsible robot that was given lethal autonomy. So humans are always kept in the loop somewhere in systems like robotic systems like drones. I agree with him. I just don't think it's, you know, I did a lot of articles on this actually a couple of years ago about creating artificial consciences and the effort to make moral systems for robots. It doesn't look good for even the distant future. So that's a problem. Humans have to be in the loop. If we let, and this goes back to my argument, if we let AI take too many autonomous decisions, then we're going to have problems because of, you know, letting that agency and that decision-making process be given to a non-human entity where its ethics are strictly limited and based on logic, and there's no emotion put in whatsoever. As for AI changing ourselves and the way we approach things, yeah, I agree. There's a great book on that was written about 20 years ago called The Fourth Discontinuity. And the whole point of the book is how, as we've made implements, those implements have also made us. For instance, our ability to have our thumbs are an evolutionary result of having made tools. We need thumbs to be able to hold a tool and use it like a hammer. So as we evolve our tools, the tools evolve us. Okay, well, that's fine, but we're talking now in AI, we're talking about tools that take on qualities of our brain and can make decisions and can usurp certain things that are important to us, like jobs. I mean, a hammer didn't put us out of a job, it enhanced our ability to do jobs. That's what I meant by talking about cobots in a more advanced situation and with more advanced technology. We need more things like hammers, but we don't need more things like robots on systems like in automobile factories, on automated belts. You know, all that stuff just displaces humans. It doesn't really benefit us as a species. Yeah, it makes more cars, and that's convenient. Kills 35, 40,000 people a year in the United States. But, you know, still, it gets us from point A to point B quicker. So I would say the stuff we have now because of AI is of a different order in magnitude in terms of tools, and it changes us by a different order of magnitude and in a different way. That I agree with, you know, Hawking and Gates and all those people, that there are dangers involved in that could be existential, depending on how we proceed. I think it's important to consider how we proceed from here on out in terms of regulations and adjusting the way we use AI. It's good. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. We can't just stop having AI. And I think a lot of it's beneficial anyway. So
just a quick follow-up, Kevin. I guess part of what I'm getting at is that in some way those two concerns are distinct from each other, so that even if it turns out that some of the decision-making AI, like the loan granting algorithms and the teacher hiring and firing algorithms and so on and so forth, even if it turns out that those do a more just job than humans do, or a more efficient job in many ways than humans do, which I don't think is impossible, those are still technologies that profoundly change basic capabilities that we value about ourselves. So in some way, part of what I'm curious about, and this was just to sort of clarify the concern, you don't really have to answer it again. Part of what I'm curious about is what happens if it turns out that on the one hand, the machines are actually in the end going to be by some standard more efficient or better than us at doing the jobs, including safer. And on the other hand, they still change us, or they still, for example, undo our need for making judgments, our need for being agentic agents. Then you have a sort of conflict between utilitarian considerations and between, what we value about ourselves types of considerations.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with you on that. I think it's all kind of rolled into one, but they're different aspects of the same problem, I think, which is rampant unregulated development of AI. I think that's the problem. I'm really at the base of my argument.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Kevin, we're at the hour. I want to tell everybody that our next talk will be Anders Sandberg from Oxford University on February 15th at 1 p.m. And he will be talking about why do we work and do we have to? Engaging speaker. I invite you all to join us. Thank you so much for speaking today, Kevin. And I hope that the Hegelian dialectic ends up with a synthesis of human and machine, as opposed to one winning out over the other, because I don't see the victory of either side as being a particularly beneficial one. But we will have many chances to talk further about these topics, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody, for listening.